welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of many beautiful books, but of one beautiful book in particular that we are here to discuss. It's a gorgeous and very touching work of historical fiction, and I can't wait to dive into it. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm Madeline Martin, and my book is The Secret Book Society. And basically, it is set in Victorian London and hosted by the enigmatic Lady Duxbury, who has been widowed 3 times. And yes, there's definitely some gossip about that. And she finds that these women are having their reading materials restricted. So she invites them to a tea party that really is kind of covering the idea that they get to have a secret book society where they get to, they're hiding their secrets, but they're also rebelling from oppression. They're having forbidden learning through books, and they are, rising together in empowerment. And as I like to say, not all revolutions begin with a bang. Some start in a book club.
Ah, so true. And like I need a Lady Duxbury in my life. I think we could all use a Lady Duxbury in our life.
Absolutely.
Before we talk too much about her, I'd love if you could introduce our listeners a little bit to your career and your other books. I'm really curious about what draws you not only to historical fiction, but to books about books, which are 2 favorite genres of mine.
Yes, they're 2 favorite genres of mine as well. So I've actually written over 40 books. A lot of people don't realize that. I used to write historical romance before I started to write historical fiction. And with historical romance, I have about like over 35 of those. I did Regency, I did medieval, and I did the 1700s. And now, and then my historical fiction, I've written 4 that were World War II. This one is Victorian, which the Victorian era has always fascinated me. And actually, my next book in 2026 is going to be set in the 1600s during the witch trials in England. So I'm telling you, I am just a history girl. You never know where I'm going to end up because it all fascinates me. And as far as, books go, like books about books, I like to say that I've always been a reader, but apparently my mom said they used to have to pay me a penny a page to read when I was little, but I don't remember, so it doesn't count. For me, I was an army brat. We moved around constantly, and I always became best friends with my librarians at school because I took so long to kind of open up and get to know real people, but I found that wonderful connection that I needed in books. They made me feel not so awkward, like I wasn't alone. Like, Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables was kind of my spirit animal, as far as the book world goes. And my favorite series that I just completely got sucked into as a child was the Laura Ingalls Wilder series, Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie. And those books I just read over and over and over again. So my heart has always been in history. And I'm always thinking about books, about what I'm reading, what I want to write, what I've read in a story, and I see something that reminds me of, oh, I read that in a book and I'm seeing it now. It's just I'm a book nerd.
Love to hear that. And yeah, I think in a lot of ways, like it's a very meaningful pivot to write a bunch of books about women at war and then to transition to women in Victorian times, which was like where the home front, where the domestic sphere was like a very different kind of war sometimes, I think, if it's
Absolutely.
a comparison. So what's the inception point for this one? Was it like the time period? Was it a particular character, a line, or just a vibe you wanted to explore?
So, and actually I knew that I really wanted to write something in the Victorian era, and I had heard about they had book societies and they had newspaper societies because books and newspapers were very expensive. And so people would oftentimes pool their money together. Like you might have a group of, 10 or 20 people who all pitch in to buy a daily newspaper and then they all share it among themselves. Of course, that was for the lower classes. And even with the higher classes, sometimes they would still have libraries that they would do together because of books being so expensive. And I liked the idea of women finding empowerment with one another. I've always been a huge advocate for women supporting other women. And I thought, well, what better way for women to find strength within themselves and support one another than within a book club? And then I also have sort of a piece of history. I already kind of had that idea in my mind, and I was just kind of poking around because you never know what you're going to find in history. And I found the most incredible story that just absolutely made my brain skyrocket into a million ideas for the story. And it was because I've also been fascinated by asylums and hysteria with women in that particular time period and how readily women could just be sent to an asylum. And so I found a story about a man who was having an affair with his wife's niece, and heaven forbid she protested. And so he put her in a carriage and sent her to a lunatic asylum just to shut her up. Well, on the way, she happened to see a boy on the street. So she threw some money and she said, "Please tell my friends that I'm being taken to this lunatic asylum." And he said, "Well, how will they know it's you?" Quick thinking, she hurriedly takes off her boot, shoves it out the window, and the carriage rattles off. This boy takes the boot to her friend's house and he shows up and he says, "Your friend has been taken." And they were actually able to find a solicitor who specialized in women who are wrongfully admitted to lunatic asylums, and they were able to free her. My gosh, the truth is stranger than fiction, right? So I thought, wow, what an amazing idea to kick off my story. So here we have the prologue of the Secret Book Society, where there is a street urchin in the middle of Lady Duxbury's drawing room, and he's holding this black kidskin leather boot with rose embroidery along the sides, and he says, "Your friend has been taken." And at the very end of the prologue, you see that little hidden compartment in the boot, and she pulls out this missive, and she recognizes her own handwriting saying, "You are cordially invited to the Secret Book Society." And then chapter one starts with the women starting to receive their invitations. And maybe you think you know who it is, but maybe you don't. You have to read the book to find out. But it was just such a like a lightning bolt of a research like nugget to find that just made my brain explode.
Wow, that is so fascinating. And it is so interesting that that is the prologue then, because that moment, that like little, originating seed, you then have to build backward from and then, forward from. Like that's a
Yes. And it was so much fun. I absolutely enjoyed doing it. In fact, this book, I was so inspired by this book. And because I had so much knowledge of the Regency era, which of course Regency and Victorian are different, but there are also a lot of foundational similarities. I wrote it in a month before I even started digging into as much of my research. And then I spent the rest of the time researching, which we can get into that a little bit more. But
I
yeah.
that was exactly my next
Oh,
question.
perfect.
Good anticipation. You wrote it so quickly, and the time from idea to book deal, it seems like was just a few months. What was that process like? You must have really spent a lot of time just like full time immersed in that story, right?
Absolutely, yes. And I do generally write my books very quickly. That is one benefit of having written so many books is that I really like my brain just is like, okay, it's time to write, and I do extensive plotting. So even before I started writing this, I still did put together character charts and a plot and everything. So I knew what was going to be happening. But yeah, I when I really get into a story, I like to just sit down and keep writing it until it's done. It's kind of like if you read a really good book and if you read it over the course of a weekend, you remember everything about it because you're so immersed in it. But if you take 6 months to read it, you might forget little nuanceical details. And so for me, I like to write my books quickly. And this is probably the first book that I've really written without doing a bunch of research up front, just kind of doing some preliminary research up front. And then after it was done, I finished it in December of 2023. And it wasn't due to my editor until August of 2024. So then I just basically spent the rest of the time doing additional research and really going through and cleaning things up and making sure that everything was as historically accurate as I could possibly make it without having lived in that time period.
Does writing a lot of books make you less afraid of like the messy first draft, because you come to do you come to trust the process over time, that like it will change over time or like I'm just curious about like when you produce books so regularly and so quickly, you must achieve a little bit of at least a little bit of faith like in your process.
Um, kind of. I will say that, like, I mean, I think every author has those one-star reviews that stick in their head, and like you can almost hear the critics and the things that they'll say about your book that are ugly. And it's so hard to turn those voices off. And it's ridiculous because, you have like tens of thousands of these beautiful, wonderful reviews that all say wonderful things about the story. And there's like a dozen of these really ugly, nasty ones. And those are the ones that are just like a burr in my brain. And so sometimes I can really get in my own head. But I will say that deadlines are a great way to overcome that. But then with this particular book, I really just had so much passion for it. Every day I would just think, you know what, I'm just enjoying this. And this book I wrote before it was contracted, which was also just a really lovely kind of gift because it was like, you know what? I'm writing this book for myself. And if nobody wants it, I've loved this experience so much that it doesn't even matter. Thank goodness I did though, because I'm really excited to get this out in the world. But I was just so excited to write it.
Oh, cool. That's a great point. Yeah, like the process can get more familiar, but like not less vulnerable. Like
Right.
putting your yeah.
Yeah, I actually, it's funny because like when you send your book out into the world, I always kind of liken it to like the first day that you send a child off to school on a bus and like you're putting your entire heart on that bus and you put it out in the world and you hope that people are kind to it. Like I hope people love you as much as I do.
So, I'd love to talk a little bit more about your research into Victorian society and women's lives and how that research shaped your four main characters, the members of your book club. They come from like a wide variety of experiences and are at different points in their life. So, what were like the exciting things you found in your research that like made it into those characters?
Well, one was Florence Nightingale. She helped to inspire Lavinia's character. So Florence Nightingale is the woman who really was almost sort of the foundational start for the Red Cross and everything that like went with these incredible um, advancements in medical care when it came to soldiers. But when she was younger, she suffered from hysteria and she thought that there was something terribly wrong with her. And so I kind of had this idea of a young woman who feels like she is inherently broken because of this quote unquote hysteria, because she's a woman and that's sort of a catch-all for everything. And really she's this beautiful genius that is sort of encapsulated in this shell of her own like making of this hysterical diagnosis. So that was one inspiration. And then as far as Rose Wharton goes, I've always been fascinated by the American dollar princesses. I mean, my gosh, what is not to be fascinated by with that? And also, it's interesting to kind of write a character that is American in a British setting. And so this was kind of the very beginning of when the American dollar princesses were being married into English aristocracy. And so she really would have been kind of one of the first ones, and it would have been a very lonely venture. And I wanted each one of these women to really have a part of themselves that was yearning for somebody else out there. And then with Eleanor, with Mrs. Eleanor Clark, I love the idea that each of these women saw one another as being completely perfect. I mean, how many times do we look at somebody and we think, gosh, I want their life, especially with social media. We see all the beautiful curated content that's out there and we wish we had their lives. But we don't ever get to go deep enough to see, is their life really as good as they're portraying it? And so these women start to kind of peel back the layers and see one another as real. And one huge inspiration that I had with Eleanor was the fact that she is in this incredibly oppressive marriage, and she really essentially has no freedoms whatsoever, with one exception, and that is her clothing. And so her clothes are this really sort of representative state of how she is feeling, and this one tiny little square of freedom that she has a modicum of an opportunity to flex just slightly, and she embraces it with her whole heart. And I've always been a really big fan of archetypes and that kind of thing, and so I really I lean into that heavily with Eleanor. And then, gosh, with Lady Duxbury. This is not at all really a historical inspiration. It's me being a total Disney nerd, but I have always loved the Haunted Mansion and the woman with all of the spouses, like all the husbands that were dead. And I've always kind of wanted to use her as like an inspiration for a character. Enter Lady Duxbury. And I had a wonderful time making her very enigmatic and mysterious, but also revealing the depth of everything that she's gone through in her life through that hidden diary. It was so fun.
Yeah, she's absolutely wonderful. And it's such a great, like, yeah, her diary is just like, I don't want to talk too much about it because it's so, but like, oh, just like that part of the story is just, Was there a character whose voice, because you do sort of like present chapters from all of their perspectives, was there somebody whose voice was the easiest to capture and somebody who was the most challenging?
Um, Gosh, that's a great question. Honestly, they all had the parts of them that were easy and the parts of them that were challenging. I think the hardest one for me was with Lavinia. And I can't do too much about it, but there is this poetic part of her, and I am not a poet, and I had to make things sound poetic. And it's like one of those things where you're like, oh, I'm going to have this character who's super clever, and they're like, oh no, now I have to be super clever. And so you have to kind of put yourself into these roles that you put your characters into. And sometimes it isn't a box that you fit into, and you have to really flex your creativity in your brain a little bit to try to make sure that you can conform to what that character needs to be. So that probably would have been the hardest part. And then, the rest of it was just making sure that all the puzzle pieces fit perfectly without anything being revealed too soon or giving away too much, or also being like, wait a minute, where did that come from? So making sure all those little puzzle pieces probably was the most difficult part.
Nice. Yeah, I always sort of imagine writing dual perspective or multi-perspective books, rather in this case, to be sort of like spinning plates because you have like multiple mini plots to maintain and the overarching sort of story and arc. And you have to, yeah, like keep, I don't know, it just seems like it's really hard to keep them all at pace with one another. And I'm always curious about like how much moving around is there in the aftermath of that first draft? Like, does the final product end up looking a lot like that first draft, or is there a lot of change in the interim?
So I actually am very fortunate that I write very clean in my first draft. And so there's not a lot of what I end up doing is a lot more refining and tightening. Rather, like when I first wrote this book, it was so overly written because I really wanted to portray that that aristocracy, like that Victorian kind of speaking style. And I just went crazy being way too verbose with it. So a lot of it was cutting so many of the words. But navigating around four protagonists is very difficult because there have been some scenes where I had written them and I realized, oh my gosh, Lavinia hasn't said anything for like 3 pages. People are going to forget that she's even here. So I like have to go back and find a page where, okay, now she says this and kind of inserts herself into the conversation because you need to make sure that they all have enough screen time on a particular scene if they're all there so that nobody forgets like that they've wandered off. And then of course you factor in having the animals with Otis the cat who hides in a vase and thinks that nobody can see him, which by the way is inspired by a friend of mine who had a cat that would do that. And then little Pluto, who just he's a little pug and it's brave little runt of a guy, and he's just the sweetest. So making sure to incorporate them into the scenes as well once I added them, being like, oh, I forgot to put Otis back in again. I need to make sure I put him into a scene. So yeah, it's a lot to balance.
That is a lot to balance. I'm having a bunch of sitcom actors with contracts who all have to make sure that they have like a certain amount of, yeah.
Exactly.
Um, I really love the way that all the characters interact, like their personalities create such a wonderful dynamic, and it's really interesting and nuanced. It's they learn a lot from each other and they grow from this experience of the book club. And what I really love about their backgrounds and the ways that they interact with each other and with the men in their lives is that you do a really good job of not just portraying like the constraints and the limits that Victorian society placed on women, but also the way that they had agency despite those constraints, if that makes sense. Like they had agency and they were able to make choices even within limits or sometimes outside those limits. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that was really interesting to explore. And I really wanted to also make sure that I didn't just write a book that was like all men are awful and all women are amazing. I mean, there are definitely good men in this book, and there are definitely bad women in this book as well. I feel like it's very important to make sure that there's an equal balance. And but yeah, there definitely were ways that women could still reclaim some of their own agency and freedom. Like, for example, like I was stating with Eleanor, where she was sort of in this trapped marriage where every single half penny that came into her possession was monitored, but she had this opportunity to have her own freedom in what she wore, and she really exercised that to the fullest of her abilities. With Rose, she was this American, and she everybody kind of expected her to just say whatever she wanted to say. And so she really didn't temper herself because she's like, this is who I've always been. And so in that particular aspect, she's able to still kind of hold on to her own freedom. And then with Lavinia, I think that Lavinia probably struggles with it the most. And that really has to do with just the fact that she doesn't feel like her own skin fits. And once her skin does start to fit, that's when beautiful things really begin to happen. And Lady Duxbury, of course, is the wealthy widow who has all of the freedom and does have the opportunity to share this immense wealth of a library with women who don't have the opportunity to have such a luxurious thing at their disposal.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, I just like to have, a safe space with a book club and a really nice library and like a couple of good friends who are always going to be there. Just sounds like such a nice tonic, and that's like
Absolutely.
true for Victorian times and for now. Like I've spent a lot of time thinking about like how book clubs even now are really like very often safe spaces for women, and it's like a place where they can have their own interests and have their own conversations. And yeah, it's really interesting to explore that phenomenon at different points in history.
Yeah, it really is. I actually have my own local neighborhood book club. We are meeting this Thursday, and I am preparing my liver for it because we always like to joke that we are a wine club who also enjoys books. So I'm reading the book and figuring out what wine I'll be bringing.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing this book with us. Just real quick before we go, you mentioned before some stuff that you're working on. What is on your horizon right now?
Yes, thank you for asking. So it's called A Time of Witches, and I do have it on Goodreads if anybody wants to add it to their Goodreads shelf. And it is a dual timeline, and it is about two women who are connected together through centuries through a curse. And basically, they are ancestor and descendant, and one of them is being tried as a witch and is destined to be burned at the stake at the witch trials in England. And the American contemporary woman has to figure out a way to save her life and rewrite history. Dun dun dun. So, and I actually just turned it in. So I'm super excited about it.
Well, congratulations. That's amazing. And I
Thank you.
cannot wait to read that. So
Thank you. It was a lot of fun to write.
all right. Well, listeners, this means it's now your turn. It's time for your homework. Please check out The Secret Book Society. It is such a good read. It's really interesting and thought-provoking, but also really touching and uplifting, ultimately, I think. And I think you'll really enjoy it. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for books. Do you have a place that you like to send people for books?
So my local book club, or I'm sorry, my local bookstore is called San Marco Books and More. You can find it on my website, madelinemartin.com, and they actually will always have personalized signed copies. Well, signed copies, I do personalize usually twice a year. But if anybody wants a signed copy, they can always get one through San Marco Books and More. Just go to the contact me form, and Desiree, the owner, is super sweet and can get you anything that you need.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, yeah, thank you for your time once again. And thank you, listeners, for your time. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.